This video is sponsored by Squarespace. A few miles from Boston, in Massachusetts, there is a deep inlet winding several miles into the interior of the country from Charles Bay and terminating in a thickly wooded swamp. On one side of this inlet is a beautiful dark grove. On the opposite side, the land rises abruptly from the water's edge into a high ridge on which grow a few scattered oaks of great age and immense size. Under one such tree, according to old legend, the pirate captain William Kidd's treasure is buried. In the late 1600s, he sailed the seas and pillaged and plundered his way to infamy, and the story goes that the riches he stole by and by were hidden in the woods for safekeeping. Moreover, the old story adds that in those woods, the pirate stumbled upon, of all things, the devil incarnate, who struck a deal with him to act as the treasure's protector. Captain Kidd, eager to set sail on another grand adventure, hastily agreed with the intention to one day return and reclaim the fortune when his marauding days were spent. Whether the devil had a hand in it or not, no one is quite sure, but just as the century turned, Captain William Kidd was captured by the English and hanged by the neck. Our story begins 26 years later in New England, where there lived near this place a meager and miserly fellow by the name of Tom Walker. He had a wife as miserly as himself, and they were so miserly that they often conspired to steal from each other. Whatever the woman could lay hands on, she hid away, and Mr. Walker would then busy himself with tracking the money down and stealing it right back. Their home played host to many a fierce conflict about what ought to have been common property. They lived together in a forlorn-looking house that stood alone and had an air of starvation. A few straggling trees, emblems of sterility, grew near it. No smoke ever curled from its chimney, no traveler stopped at its door. They owned a miserable horse whose ribs protruded from hunger, and sometimes it would lean its head over the fence and look piteously at passers-by, petitioning for deliverance from this land of famine. The house and its inmates had altogether a bad name. Tom Walker's wife was a tall and terrible woman, full of temper, loud of tongue, and strong of arm. Her voice was often heard in warfare with her husband, and his face sometimes showed signs that their conflicts were not always confined to words. One day, after a rather pitiful defeat on the battlefield, Tom Walker went drinking. The local tavern had oft served as a safe haven from which he could lick his wounds. It took all morning, all afternoon, and most of the evening, but by and by his sorrows were sufficiently drowned, and he set out for home in a stupor. Perhaps for the liquor in his belly or the funny gleam of the moonlight on a weary evening, Tom thought within himself to take a shortcut homewards through the swamp, which, like most drunken shortcuts, quickly turned to an ill-chosen route. The swamp was thickly grown with great gloomy pines and hemlocks, some of them 90 feet high. It was full of pits and quagmires, partly covered with weeds and mosses, where the green surface often betrayed the traveler into a gulf of black, smothering mud. There were also dark and stagnant pools, the abodes of the tadpole, the bullfrog, and the water snake, and where trunks of pines and hemlocks lay half-drowned, half-rotting, looking like alligators sleeping in the mire. With only the hoot of owls to keep him company, Tom made his way through this treacherous forest, stepping from tuft to tuft of rushes and roots which afforded precarious footholds along the way. It was late in the dusk of evening that Tom Walker finally arrived at a piece of firm ground on which sat an old Indian fort, a stronghold during their wars with the first colonists. It was there he paused for a while to rest himself. Had he a more level-headed disposition, Mr. Walker might have been quickly on his way. Stories handed down from the time of the Indian Wars put it that the old shamans would hold incantations there and made sacrifices to a great evil spirit or some such. Tom sat on the trunk of a fallen hemlock and listened to the boding cry of a tree toad as he absent-mindedly poked his walking stick at a mound of black mold near his feet. As he turned up the soil unconsciously, his staff struck against something hard. He raked it out of the vegetable mold, and lo, a cloven skull with a tomahawk buried into it. the rust of the weapon indicating much time had elapsed since the death blow had been dealt. Tom gave a whistle and began to pull the skull from the ground.
"Leave that skull alone."
A gruff voice sounded from nearby, giving Tom quite the startle, and he lifted his eyes to see a man seated directly opposite him on the stump of a smaller tree. The stranger was dressed in a rude, half-Indian garb and had a red belt swathed round his body. His face was dingy and begrimed with soot, as if he had been accustomed to toil among fires and forges. He had a shock of coarse black hair that stood out from his head in all directions, and he bore an axe on his shoulder. He scowled for a moment at Tom with a pair of great red eyes. "What are you doing on my grounds?" His voice seemed to reach Tom from all directions. "Your grounds?" said Tom with a sneer. "No more your grounds than mine. These belong to the Deacon Peabody." "Deacon Peabody," said the stranger. "A man who ought to look more on his own sins and less on his neighbors. Look yonder and see how Deacon Peabody be faring." Tom looked in the direction that the stranger pointed and beheld one of the great trees, fair and flourishing without, but rotten at the core, and saw that it had been nearly hewn through, so that the first high wind was likely to blow it down. On the bark of the tree was scored the name of Deacon Peabody. He then looked round and found most of the tall trees marked with the names of some great men of the colony, and all, more or less, scored by the axe. The one on which Tom had been seated bore the name of Crowninshield, a mighty rich man who made a vulgar display of his wealth, said to have died just that week.
"At this rate,"
said the man with a growl of triumph,
"I'm likely to have a good stock of firewood for winter."
"What right have you," said Tom, "to cut down Deacon Peabody's timber?"
"The right of a prior claim,"
said the other.
"This woodland belonged to me far before your people found their way here."
"And pray, who are you, if I may be so bold?" said Tom.
"Oh, I go by many names. I am the wild huntsman in some countries, the black miner in others, king of the bottomless pit, or sometimes son of perdition."
Tom's voice became stiff. "As I take it," he spoke, "you or he commonly called Old Scratch."
"The same,"
the man returned with a half-civil nod.
"At your service."
Such was the beginning of a long and earnest conversation between the two. While one would presume meeting such a singular personage in that wild and lonely place would shake any man's nerves, Tom was a hard-minded fellow, not easily daunted. The only devil that scared him was the one he went home to every evening. By and by, the men warmed to one another and set out for a walk.
"Tell me something, Tom,"
spoke Old Scratch.
"Suppose you could lay hold on a great sum of money."
"Money?" Tom returned with rising interest.
"A treasure, of sorts, buried by an old pirate long since chopped down, the whole of which is under the oak trees on a high ridge not too far from where we walk now. All under my command, and protected so that no man can find it, but by gaining my favor."
"I suppose this treasure should come with certain conditions," said Tom.
"You suppose rightly."
"May I be permitted to inquire of them?" It is said that Old Scratch then leaned over and whispered something into Tom's ear that made him recoil in disgust. Whatever the conditions were, Tom never disclosed publicly, but such was surely a heavy price, for Tom requested time to think the terms over. When they had reached the edge of the swamp, Old Scratch turned to Tom Walker and nodded.
3 nights and 3 days to make up your mind. Come back to the fort when you have your answer."
"What proof have I that all you have been telling me is true?" said Tom.
"Here be my signature,"
said Old Scratch, pressing his finger on Tom's forehead, and then, turning off among the thickets of the swamp, sunk down, down, down into the earth until he totally disappeared. When Tom reached home, he found the black print of a finger burnt into his forehead, which nothing could obliterate. The mark brought questions and even accusations from his wife, and although Tom generally hid his private business from her prying eyes and ears, this was of all things a most uneasy secret, so he willingly shared it. Her skepticism soon gave way to greed at the mention of a hidden treasure, and she urged her husband to comply with Old Scratch's terms and secure what would make them both wealthy for life. However Tom might have felt about the deal, he was predisposed to never, under any circumstances, appease his wife, so out of the mere spirit of contradiction, he flatly refused. And a night and a day was spent in a bitter quarrel. Neither slept, and as Tom spent his day in town fuming over his wife spent her day at home fuming over her husband, until the late afternoon, when the thought dawned on Mrs. Walker to strike the bargain with Old Scratch herself. With a fearless temper, she set off for the fort. Tom returned home to an empty house and waited. Hours passed, and the missus finally returned. Her face wore a look of defeat, and sullen in her replies, she spoke of a woodsman she had met about twilight, chopping at the base of a tall tree. The man was foul-tempered and would not come to terms. She was determined to go again, bearing a gift of reconciliation, though what this gift was, she refused to say. And a night and a day was spent in silent and solitary scheming by the inhabitants of that terrible home. That next morning, as Tom prepared for work, his wife made it known she would be off to meet the woodsman and back by sundown. With an apron heavy laden by silver teapots and spoons and every portable article of value, she left the house, and Tom Walker went to work. With the day spent, he returned home and found the house empty again. Tom sat in the kitchen, growing more anxious and more angry minute by minute. Slowly, yet surely, he reached a tipping point and set out at length to find his wife and fetch his property. At a certain late hour, he arrived at the Indian fort and searched the gloomy grounds, but found no wife. He called her name repeatedly, but only the owls answered. By and by, Tom Walker's attention was attracted by the clamor of carrion crows that were hovering above a cypress tree. He looked and beheld a bundle tied in an apron and hanging from the branches. At this, Tom leapt with joy, for he recognized his wife's apron and supposed it to contain the household valuables. "Let us get hold of the property," he said consolingly to himself, "and we will endeavor to do without the woman." As he scrambled to the apron, the crows above sailed off screaming into the deep shadows of the forest. Tom seized the cloth, but, woeful sight, found nothing inside but a heart and a liver. Tom supposed his wife had attempted to deal with Old Scratch the way she tended to deal with him, but even a woman's cold fury couldn't best the devil. He took note that deeply stamped about the tree were prints of cloven feet and handfuls of coarse black hair. Tom shook his head in sympathy, muttering under his breath that whatever had happened, Old Scratch must have had a tough time of it. He found his way to a stump and sat, consoling himself most of all for the loss of his property. Though a silver lining was to be seen, beneath his sorrow was a strange sense of gratitude for the woodsman who, he quietly considered, had done him a kindness. It is said Tom waited on the stump for hours, hoping his acquaintance would appear, but Old Scratch played shy. For whatever people may think, he is not always to be had when called for. He knows, after all, how to play his cards and when to let his game play theirs. Just before sunrise, Tom stood to leave, and lo came the woodsman, with an axe on his shoulder, humming a certain tune. "I've returned with an answer," Tom spoke to Old Scratch.
"And perhaps a few questions."
Old Scratch put back with a nod toward the cloth sat on top of Tom's lap. "My valuables," Tom said, and Old Scratch laughed at that.
"Yes, your effects. You might ask the birds."
"And the woman?"
"Now, Tom, let's be quick, for morn is at hand, and we have such great business."
"The treasure. My answer." Are the conditions the same?
Indeed, but one more as a price for delays. The money I point you to, I charge that above all, it be used in service to me.
To you?
To me. The profits be yours, but the treasure be mine. The funds for a slave ship, perhaps.
This, however, Tom flatly refused. A devil's servant I may be, but such a business I shan't turn to. Finding Tom so squeamish on this point, Old Scratch let it go, but proposed instead that he should turn moneylender, for the devil desired an increase in such ranks, looking upon loan sharks as his own peculiar people. To this, no objections were made, for it was just to Tom's taste.
You shall open a broker's shop in Boston next month.
I'll do it tomorrow, if you wish, said Tom Walker.
You shall lend money at 2% a month.
Aye, I'll charge 4.
You shall extort bonds, foreclose mortgages, drive the shopkeeper to bankruptcy.
I'll drive him to you. Old Scratch clapped his hands in a burst of delight.
The treasure be yours at the close of this night.
By the end of the week, Tom Walker sat behind a marble desk in a counting house in Boston. His reputation would spread far and wide as a man who gave loans liberally. A speculating fever had ripped through the country to an alarming degree, and its end had come just as suddenly, knocking many on hard times. At this auspicious time of public distress, Tom Walker's door was quickly thronged by customers. The needy and the adventurous, the gambling speculator, the dreaming land jobber, the thriftless tradesman, the merchant with cracked credit. In short, every person driven to raise money by desperate means and desperate sacrifices hurried to Tom Walker. Thus, Tom was the universal friend of the needy, though he acted as a friend in need. That is to say, he always exacted good pay and good security. In proportion to the distress of the applicant was the hardness of his terms. He accumulated bonds and mortgages, gradually squeezed his customers closer and closer, and sent them, at length, dry as a sponge from his door. In this way he made money hand over hand, becoming a rich and mighty man, and built himself, as usual, a vast house out of vanity, but left most of it unfinished and unfurnished out of his own miserliness. He even set up a carriage in the fullness of his vainglory, though he nearly starved the horses which drew it, and as the ungreased wheels groaned and screeched about town, you would have thought you were hearing the souls of the poor debtors he was squeezing. As Tom waxed old, however, he grew thoughtful. Having secured the good things of this world, he began to feel anxious about those of the next. By and by it came to be that he thought with regret on the bargain he had made in the swamp with Old Scratch, and he set his wits to work to cheat him out of the conditions. Old Tom Walker became, therefore, all of a sudden, a violent churchgoer. He prayed loudly and strenuously, as if heaven were to be taken by force of lungs. Indeed, one might always tell when he had sinned most during the week by the clamor of his Sunday devotion. The quiet Christians who had been modestly and steadfastly traveling Zionward were struck with self-reproach at seeing themselves so suddenly outstripped in their career by this new-made convert. Tom became as rigid in religion as he was in money matters. He was a stern supervisor of his neighbors' affairs, and seemed to think every sin entered up to their account became a credit on his side of the page. Tom's zeal became as notorious as his riches. Still, in spite of all this strenuous attention to forms, Tom had a lurking dread that the devil would have his due. That he might not be taken unawares, therefore, it is said that he carried a small Bible in his coat pocket and a large one upon his counting desk, and would frequently be found reading it when people called on business. Then, with nary a thought, he would lay his green spectacles on the book, mark the place, and turn round to exploit his countrymen with yet another crooked deal. Some say that Tom grew paranoid in his old age, and fancying his own end approaching, had a horse shod, saddled, and bridled at the ready to give Old Scratch a run for it. Then, on one hot afternoon in the dog days, just as a terrible black thunder gust was coming up, Tom sat in his counting house in his white linen cap and silk morning gown. He He was busy foreclosing a mortgage, by which he would complete the ruin of an unlucky land speculator for whom he had professed the greatest friendship. The poor man begged him to grant a few months' indulgence, but old Tom grew testy and refused another day. "My family will be ruined and brought upon the parish," said the land jobber. "Charity begins at home," Tom replied. "I must take care of myself in these hard times." You have made so much money out of me," said the speculator. Tom lost his patience and his piety. "The devil take me," said he, "if I have made even a penny." Just then, there were 3 loud knocks at the street door. Tom stepped out and found Old Scratch sitting atop a black horse, which neighed and stamped with impatience.
"Tom, you called."
Tom shrunk back, but too late. The little Bible was tucked in his coat on a rack in his office, and the other sat buried under the mortgage on his desk. It said that Old Scratch whisked him away on a thunderclap, his helpless cries drowned out by the wail of the wind. Tom Walker would never return to foreclose that mortgage. A countryman who lived on the borders of the swamp reported that in the height of the thundergust, he heard a great clattering of hooves and a howling along the road, and that when he ran to the window, he just caught sight of a woodsman on a horse that galloped like mad across the fields, over the hills, and down into the black hemlock swamp toward the old Indian fort. A moment later, a thunderbolt fell, which seemed to set the whole forest ablaze. The good people of Boston shook their heads and shrugged their shoulders, and not long after, trustees were appointed to take charge of Tom's effects. Yet, strangely, nothing of value was to be found. Upon searching his coffers, all his bonds and mortgages were found reduced to cinders. In place of gold and silver, his iron chest was filled with chips and shavings. 2 skeletons lay in his stable instead of his half-starved horses, and his great house took fire and burned to the ground. Such was the end of Tom Walker and his ill-gotten wealth. The hole under the oak trees, from whence he dug kids' money, is to be seen to this day, and the neighboring swamp and old Indian fort is often haunted on stormy nights by a figure on horseback, a woodsman swinging an old axe. This video is sponsored by Squarespace. I love telling stories. Maybe you do too. If you have a creative idea, you're probably looking for a way to get it seen, and these days the best way to do so is often through your own personalized website. Squarespace provides you the tools to build a beautiful site tailored for your message. Start by selecting from one of their many stunning customizable templates and then shape it to your specific needs. If you're an aspiring musician or podcaster, audio blocks take the headache out of the entire process. If you have multiple social media accounts that you need to take care of, then you can do so all at once with their simultaneous posting feature. Even if you have a product or a piece of art that you want to sell, Squarespace makes it easy to set up an online storefront. You can get started today by going to squarespace.com and starting a free trial. Then when you're ready to launch, head over to squarespace.com/AustinMcConnell and save 10% on your first purchase of a website or domain.